Hi everyone, welcome to our author Q&A with Pierz Newton-John. Welcome Pierz.
Thank you. Good to be
My
here.
name's Kate Liston-Mills. I'm the current host of Little Fictions on Air. I'm also a lover and writer of short stories. So it's very exciting for me to be here with Pierz today. You might remember we did one of Pierz's short stories earlier in the year called Salt. Very powerful story about a daughter caring for her dying father. It's still stuck with me. The story which we will be discussing today is Different Kinds of Heaven, which is from the same collection, Fault Lines, and it is equally powerful, but a very different story indeed from Salt. So welcome Pierz to the program, and I wondered if you could give us a little intro about yourself, who you are, what it is you write and why you write.
Yeah, so I used to be a psychotherapist for many years, and I haven't done that for a few years. So now I'm actually a software developer, so I've had a complete kind of change in direction. And I wrote Fault Lines over a period of about 5 years, well, Fault Lines was published in 2012, so up until that time. So more recently, I've been more working on essays rather than short stories. I still dabble a little bit with short stories, but and I do intend to go back to it. But it's just I've been taking a little bit of a different direction more recently.
Sure. The story that we're doing today is Different Kinds of Heaven, which is from Fault Lines. I was wondering if for those listeners out there that may not have listened to it yet or read it, whether you could give a brief summary about what it is about and what it was born out of.
Yeah, so it's about a guy who's been through a difficult divorce, and after a couple of years where he hasn't been talking to his ex-partner, he's just got custody of his young daughter, and he's still sort of struggling with parenting, single parenting, and he's sort of struggling to find his feet with it a little bit.
It's very hard.
And he's also trying to, establish he's also trying to establish a new relationship with a sort of emotionally unavailable young woman. So I guess in terms of what it was born out of, at the time, that sort of 5-year period of my life when I was writing the stories and in Fault Lines, I was in a sort of a similar situation to that. Not exactly the same, but I had, separated from a long-term relationship. I did have a young child, and I was sort of in and out of these various not particularly satisfying relationships. So in terms of write what you know, I guess that one ticked the boxes.
I was wondering if you felt comfortable today sharing a passage from the text. There are so many passages you could choose from, but do you feel comfortable doing that today for us, Pierz?
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Okay. He took her to he's talking about his young daughter, May. He took her to the Collingwood Children's Farm, where for a time he thought he'd failed again, until he understood that this stillness, this somber concentration, was her expression of rapture. She held the guinea pigs like a sacred responsibility. Then afterwards they walked along the Yarra in a fine wash of sunlight, past the serrated skyline of the old factories, the embankments of yellow soursubs. She picked the fattest ones and happily chomped their squeaky stems from the nub up, a childhood delicacy he remembered well, though the taste disgusted him when he had a nibble for old time's sake. She chewed them thoughtfully, and he could see she was puzzling something out. Then she said, "What if I don't like heaven, Dad? I mean, when I die?" "You will. Everyone likes heaven." "Are there different kinds of heaven for different people?" "I don't know, sweetie. Maybe you get what you want. Maybe your heaven would be a garden with the hugest soursubs." She walked silently for a while, studying the river, the people quietly whirring by on their bicycles. Then she said cheerfully, definitively, "My heaven would just be a normal life." He knew what she meant. This was enough, right here, right now, and she could foresee not a single shadow. "Oh, darling," he said, stopping to crouch and gather her into his coat, his sudden change of mood confusing her. This love was not fair, he thought. He'd been tricked. His own heart was armoured and weary and protected because he considered himself disposable, not really so important. But loving her made a break in his defences through which pain could get in again, along with the light she brought. Against this weakness, there was no possible protection.
So good. It's got such like grief in it and vulnerability. It's just a powerful piece. Thank you for reading that, Pierz. And I was thinking about your writing processes, and in regards to what you just said about, you know, being quite close to your life at the time when you were writing. You said in this interview for Salt that autobiography is a great starting point when writing stories. And this is a quote: "It's like an armature you build on. Through the story, though the stories seldom remain there, and it gives you the confidence and structure to start crafting something, and then slowly the thing wants to take shape. It eventually becomes what it needs to be." Is this how Different Kinds of Heaven was written, and the rest of Fault Lines at large?
I find autobiography, like the notion of armature. An armature is like when you're building a sculpture, you have like a metal frame or something that you build a sculpture on top of. And I find that to be a really good metaphor for how I use autobiography, in a sense that I'll often start from my own experience as an emotional reference point, and also to give structure, and sometimes also those little bits of unexpected detail that if you make stuff up completely, your imagination falls short of reality. Reality often has more of those sort of quirks and interesting things in it. So I find it useful from that point of view, but I also find that it starts to want to go in its own direction. So that's why it's more like a skeleton that's underneath the story that I end up with. So with that particular story, there's quite a few details that come out from my life. But so when I picture it, it takes place in the shared house that I was living in around that time. But the characters are different. So Mickey's not really me, and the child and the lover are not the people. But there's definitely a lot that comes from my life, and with Fault Lines in general, there's a few stories, maybe a third of them sort of come from, start out from some autobiographical starting point. A lot of them, some of them are just purely sort of made up, and then other ones, as I worked as a therapist for many years, I think there's 3 or 4 stories that came out of that work.
Yeah, I always find it really hard to go between real characters in my life and putting them into writing. And sometimes I go, why don't I just write memoir? I think it'd be easier, but there is so much fun in building from that real base and then fleshing out how you feel it needs to go. I love how you've described that. My next question is quite a big one to unpack, and it follows on from the last one, and it's in regards to your whole collection, Fault Lines. Do you believe it is of a particular era now? And if you were to write it again, how much do you think it would differ, especially in terms of writing about masculinity?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, when I pick it up again and read parts of it, and I think I read it through the lens of today, and I think the world really has changed so much, and particularly in regards to social attitudes to masculinity. I mean, when I wrote Fault Lines, there was, the term toxic masculinity wasn't a thing really. I mean, it wasn't a widely known thing anyway, even though it's really a major theme of the book. And so when I think about how I would write it, I mean, I wouldn't write the same book again, obviously, because I'm not in the same place. And but if I was writing about those themes, I think I would write them very differently, and I think I'd be more constrained by the imaginary reader of the book, if you like. I think I wonder if I would feel the need to more strongly signal my disapproval of the toxically masculine characters in the book, which in a way it's a shame that I would feel it,
Yeah.
that I would feel that. But, I think about, like, there's one story, Shock, in which the protagonist is this unpleasant, sexist, predatory character, probably, arguably racist, and he picks up this Black American girl in a bar, pretending to be her internet date. And, and I look at it now, I think, wow, that is really a minefield. Politically speaking, it's a minefield, but I wasn't, at the time, I didn't think of it like that at all. I just wrote it quite, people like writing, there's a certain fun in writing bad characters. Like, it's sort of liberating to write to write a bad guy.
Yeah.
And so I sort of enjoyed writing it in that way. But I think if I was writing it now, I'd be a little bit scared, and it might even put me off even attempting it. So I think things are definitely changed. And I think writing can be quite a fraught thing in terms of the politics that surround stories that we try to tell. And there's certainly, there's a whole sort of debate about appropriating stories, and what stories are we allowed to tell, what stories are we allowed to own. I think that's it's a difficult one. I understand the sensitivities around it. I also feel as a writer sometimes that I don't know, like, I don't want to be constrained in the stories that I'm allowed to tell, but I understand why those sensitivities exist.
Yes, it's a really hard one. I think it would be a great shame for the world if that book was written now. I think it's really powerful how it is, and I do wonder how many stories we're losing in this world of PC and trying to be correct and not. But again, you have to be so sensitive.
I mean, I'm not sort of signaling approval for any of the characters. And there's the funny part about this book is my current partner, I gave her the book to read when we weren't together, before we were together. It nearly put her off me because she read stories like Shock, and she's like, are these stories autobiographical? And I'm like, there's some that, and she was like, oh my God, like, I'm never going out with this guy.
But it's fiction. It's fiction. You have to maintain
exactly. It's fiction, and you're drawing out dark parts of the world and dark parts of yourself to look at, and the thing that I found really liberating about writing fiction after being a therapist was not having to analyze and judge and just being able to describe and being free to tell any story.
Yeah.
I do think it's a shame if we lose that freedom.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was reading Angela's Parrot's a few days ago now, but there is this scene on I think it's a train or a bus, where there's the Angela in is it Doug? And Doug makes a comment about what she's wearing, how she's ended up in that situation because of what she's wearing. And he kind of helps her, coaxes her out of that situation. And I was thinking, would you write the same thing now? But just because it is a different world doesn't mean it's any less, I guess, relevant. And we still need to have those conversations to move forward and to, I think it's a real shame if people stop talking about those characters and stop talking about those ideas and concepts.
And that's another example of a story that has some autobiography in it, in that, I remember I traveled in India, this would have been 1989, it was a long time ago. And I met a girl there, and that was what she told me was her experience. Was that she was not aware of the cultural sensitivities of wearing, like revealing clothing in that country, and as a result attracted a lot of unwanted attention to herself without really understanding the cultural context to that. But of course, now it has this whole other layer of her being in the story, her being blamed for attracting that attention, which of course is not, you know, is a whole other issue. But I can see why that becomes problematic.
But it is such a great platform to have those conversations, to springboard those conversations.
Yeah,
it's a great moment.
That's right.
With Different Kinds of Heaven, you've managed to fit so much into it as a short story. Like, there's so much in there. I mean, when I started reading it initially, I thought, oh, it's like a relationship drama. I like these two characters. I'm excited about where this is going to go. But then it becomes something incredibly different with this much deeper element to it. Mickey's dealing with how to be a father, his own inadequacies, as we've talked about. He's dating Zoe, who seems to be a woman who finds it very hard to fall in love. And you've also got the grief of Mickey's breakup with Kathy, which I think is a really a beautiful exploration into, you know, the trickiness of co-parenting and also being from a male's perspective. I haven't seen that done much in the short story form before, I guess because it's such a big topic. And a tricky one to unpack. But you've also got the existential kind of breakthrough, the beautiful moments with like the passage you read out with Little May. What does Different Kinds of Heaven show readers and writers about, I guess, the possibilities and limitations of the short story form, do you think? And why did you choose to tell the story in that way?
Well, you know, I told it that way because I don't have much choice. But I still haven't really managed to understand or to really to manage the novel writing process very well, because I think, you know, the novel sits somewhere between. Sorry, the short story sits somewhere between a novel and a poem, and I find it hard not to aim for that kind of poetic precision, if you like, and letting go of that and just writing in that sort of more fluid way that's required for a novel is difficult for me. I actually interviewed Ben Okri a while back, and he had a great quote, which was that a novel is like a river and a short story is like a glass of water. And I really love that because it says something about, there's so much packed into that image about, you know, the short story. It sort of has that aesthetic minimalism to it, and it has that sort of transparency and that sort of distilled quality. And he was trying to help me a little bit with the novel, which I was struggling with, saying, you know, you've got to just keep flowing with a novel. Whereas I sort of have this sort of need to sort of polish and cut and trim like it, you know, like you're sort of shaping a gem or something. And that's a very different type of process. So I mean, I'm so used to that process that it's difficult to transition to the other way of writing. But, you know, now when I look at Different Kinds of Heaven, I see that it is really focused about love and grief and vulnerability and how we try to protect ourselves from the vulnerability that loving entails, but also then discover that that's impossible to do that, that it's fundamental to love that we grieve and that we're vulnerable. There's no way around that. But we keep hoping that there's going to be some way we can have our cake and eat it too, that we can love and be invulnerable at the same time. But I didn't have that. Yeah, you can't do that. But I didn't have that sort of intellectually formulated in my head when I was writing it or anything like that. It was, but I think that you need to, with a short story, at a certain point, I don't necessarily know what I'm trying to say when I start writing, but at a certain point, this real clarity has to emerge, which is not an intellectual clarity of understanding what it is I'm trying to say, but it's a sort of an emotional and aesthetic clarity about what I'm trying to say. So, yeah, and I think that is something that is, maybe it's not unique to the short, but it's particularly distilled in the short story form. And that's one of the reasons I enjoy it.
And a cup of water is, it quenches the thirst very well.
Yes, that's
It's a
right.
big
Yeah,
payoff to the short story.
yeah, that's right. And it somehow resonates and stays with you sometimes in a way that, in a different way to a novel, maybe in a way that's more like a poem.
Yeah, I remember in a response you gave on the Facebook book club, you said it was advice for short story writers to find the center. And I think
Yes.
that's what you just hit the nail on the head with. And I think with a novel, you spend a lot of time fleshing out that center. With a short story, the reader kind of has to work to find that center. But I love the center in different kinds of heaven, that center of what love really is and what you have to do to be able to love deeply. And that vulnerability goes hand in hand with it. Are you working on anything at the moment, Pierz?
I'm working on something which I've sort of tentatively calling the philosophical gardener, which is sort of
That sounds great.
philosophical thoughts. Yeah, philosophical thoughts that occur to me while I'm in the garden, which has sort of become my favourite place during lockdown. And
that could be a YouTube series as well.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's even a book in it. And I know there's a really great book about the therapeutics of gardening, but this is more sort of philosophical ideas about that. Yeah, that come out of the garden process. So that's what I'm writing, and that's what I have been writing more recently. I've written a lot of stuff for Dumbo Feather magazine, but it's sort of more in the essay form. But I am feeling the pull back towards fiction recently, so I'd love to get get stuck into some stories again.
Well, that is good news, Pierz.
Thank you.
We're almost out of time, Pierz. Unfortunately, I had a couple more questions, but I guess we'll finish with any advice you'd give any emerging writers out there.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the one about the center, and I think the one rule that I've found that I have not been able to break with a short story, and I try to break as many as I can, but this is the one that I can't, is that it has to have a single center, unlike a novel, which can sort of be rambling like a yarn, literally. But I think that, talking about different kinds of heaven, there are these two emotional centers, Zoe and May, but the story didn't work until we met at the end. Like I rewrote that story a number of times, and until I had that moment where they came together, and there was that grief and the comfort that came from May, the story didn't really work, and that's what gave it the center. So I think, in terms of, if you're struggling with writing a story, then it helps to ask yourself, what is the center? What is the emotional center? The other thing I'd say is that it's sort of like writing a short story is like that game where you have like a structure that's built out of little bars, and you start pulling out the bars to see how many you can pull out until the whole thing falls down. You know that game?
I do.
And I think writing stories is a bit like that. It's like you write the first draft, then you keep pulling stuff out,
creating the blank space
just up to the point where it collapses. Yeah, exactly. And seeing how much you can make out of the negative space.
Yeah.
Because every sentence and every word has to be
such
vital,
a great analogy.
in both senses of the word vital. Yeah, I think that's the way that I see it. How much can you take away and still have it say what it needs to say?
Brilliant. Well, thanks, Pierz, for joining us today.
Thanks, it was a pleasure.
Great chat. Pierz Newton-John's stories have appeared extensively in Australian literary journals: Meanjin, Overland, New Australian Stories, Kill Your Darlings, The Sleeper's Almanac. He won the Alan Marshall Award in 2008, and his full short story collection, Fault Lines, is available right now on the Spineless Wonders website. Thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you especially to Pierz today for his insights.
Okay.
Thank you.